This is Freddie News Review, the podcast. And now, America's independent voice, Rob Ready.
Now it's time for Talk and Tug with Dr. Tommy Curry every Thursday. Texas A&M's Dr. Tommy Curry. How are you, sir?
Hey, sir, not too bad. How are you today?
Good, good. Tell me what we're talking about today.
Today we're talking about the delusion of hope.
Let's talk about it.
I want to continue a thought that I introduced last week when I condemned the murder of Jordan Davis. Now, last week I pointed out that no other historical racialized group of people are content enough to accept their own death as a necessary fulfillment of their citizenship and American democracy. But what I want to talk about today is how we now have a group of black scholars and black intellectuals who are now rewarded for their silence on the death of black boys and black men. But what we do is we rationalize these losses as fuels to start conversation with white people. And we pimp out the religious dogma of hope in a climate where we have economic and political vulnerabilities to the prison industrial complex and white vigilantism, right? So we have conversations about Trayvon Martin died, Jordan Davis died, and what we do is we're not mourning that as a community. We're not mourning that as a loss to our own people, but we're using those people's deaths, black academics specifically, are using those deaths to try to start conversations with white people who are either indifferent or hostile to the fact that we're losing black people in the first place, right? So the first thing is that we have a dishonest reading of the actual conditions of black men and black boys in America. Now, I want to give you a very recent example of this, right? Now, if you look at Melissa Harris Perry's own rhetoric when Trayvon Martin was killed, she created a guide for how white people can talk about Trayvon Martin. Now, her brother was just shot. We have an issue where we say there's a racial situation. She creates a guide to tell white people how they can have a conversation about that. Now, you fast forward a year later, when Jordan Davis is killed, now she's saying, well, America's no country for black men and black boys. Now, I agree with this letter of sentiment, but I have to question, as a black intellectual, why did you use the death of a black boy to further your interest in speaking to white people about the suffering that black men have to take on almost singularly in American society? Now, before I was even born, some scholars like Robert Staple argued, he wrote this article, it was called Masculinity and Race, the Dual Dilemma of Black Men, argued that black men were not simply endangered because of their skin color, because they were black, but they were also killed because they were men. Now, today, this insight is completely lost because in the identity politics arena, it's only big enough for the economic aspirations of college-educated white women and the social mobility aspirations of a small pocket of women of color, specifically black women, who don't really get any kind of cachet talking about the death of these people, especially in the academy. Now, I do want to be clear. While I think black feminism is partially blamed for the academic erasure of the systemic misery and death of black people, or black men, that black men suffer, by police, governments, white terrorists, whatever the case may be, right? And they privilege, in fact, their own economic and bourgeois class interests in the university. We also have to put fault here with the black community, because what the black community is willing to do is use the religious fervor of people like King. They're willing to use the lessons they learn in Sunday school from their pastors and the priests, or they believe politicians who try to pimp out hope. People who say that despite the deliberate murder of the youth, the economic marginalization of poverty you suffer, your political impotence, you can still believe that a better day is coming. And what's problematic about this idea of hope is that you say that the people who oppress you, the people who are indifferent to your suffering, the people who are even hostile to your existence, as we see with the people giving donations with Trayvon Martin, those people, you don't have to do anything because there's a religious belief that one day they'll change. There's a leap of faith that you can somehow do nothing and have the world improve simply because white people will change how they view black people. Now, my view is that hope is a delusional psychosis. It demands that black people change their whole view of reality. It says that you have to not look at reality and embrace an optimism that is completely opposite to your survival instinct. And in this society, where black men are abused, where black men are shot, where black boys are sentenced to jail for things that white people do on a routine basis, it tells us that we have to have an investment in believing an idea that we'll probably never live to see or certainly can't benefit from seeing. And when we have these types of problems as a community, and think about, again, how I was saying last week that we need to hold our black intellectuals accountable for how they answer to our community. When our community suffers from these types of problems, economic degradation, political impotence, and death, then we cannot afford to continue endorsing people, views, scholarship, news people, all these people who are our public voice, telling us that we have to ignore that reality. And furthermore, when we are told that we can acknowledge that reality, we certainly should not do it on the terms where we have to talk to white people to get them to acknowledge and debate about our own suffering. The reality of this situation is that white nationalism has increased, white vigilantism has increased, police brutality has increased, poverty has increased, and black people still remain content, despite the fact that we remain victims, to continue celebrating the symbolic ventures that we get of Obama and the fact that we have a small class of black people doing well in this horrible economic situation. Our children are dying, and we have to make a very real political and intellectual agenda in terms of how to talk about that responsibly and try to act on it politically.
Wow. Dr. Tommy Curry, you're on fire, sir. On fire.
Appreciate it, sir.
How can folks get in contact with you?
They can hit me up on Twitter at Dr. TJC.
That is Dr. Tommy Curry every Thursday, Talking Tough with Dr. Tommy Curry of Texas A&M.
You've been listening to Ready News Review, the podcast with America's independent voice. Rob Redding, presented by Redding Communications Incorporated. For all the pressing news you need to know, log on to www.readingnewsreview.com.